Okay, Ghalib, you can start.
Hello and welcome everyone. Today our webinar is focusing on how the war in Ukraine has affected Russia's policy and presence in the Middle East. It's been more than a year since the beginning of the war, which represent a critical juncture not only in international affairs but also in regional affairs, bearing in mind that Russia has emerged as a major powers in the Middle East. It has very much shaped the course of the events in places like Libya, in places like Syria. It's a major power in Eastern Mediterranean. So it's a major extra-regional power in the Middle East. And today we aim to take stock of this effect of the war on the place of Russia in the Middle East and also on Middle East in general. Last week we also had, as part of this series, we had the Ukraine Special Envoy for the Middle East and North Africa, for Middle East and Africa. We had a very lively discussion with him, a close discussion with him at the Middle East Council on global affairs. So today's webinar will be a follow-up, and there will be another webinar next in our series that will be focusing on this issue from another angles, which particularly will be focusing on how the war has affected Russia's place and presence in regional conflict zones, which will be moderated by my colleague, Yahya Zubur. So without further ado, we have a great list of panelists. So I would like to start the conversation right away. We have Andrei Kortunov, who is the director of the Russian International Affairs Council. And we also have Hanna Norte, Hamid Raza Azizi, the two foremost analysts on Russia and the Middle East. So welcome, everyone. Without further ado, Andrei, let me start with you, actually. To start with the topical question, which is basically, how has the war affected Russia's place in the Middle East, and what has been the implication of this war on Russia in the Middle East?
Thank you, Gallup. How much time would you grant me?
7 minutes, if possible.
Okay. First of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this conference. I think it's timely and important. I just got back to Moscow from Doha, where I participated to a board meeting of one of the foundations that I participate to. But since, I have only 7 minutes, let me limit myself to 4 points, and I'll try to spend definitely not more than 2 minutes on each of the points. And I'll try to describe how I see the changes in the Russian position regarding 4 major countries or groups of countries in the region. The first is Iran, the second is Israel, the third is the GCC group, and finally the fourth is Syria. And I'll try to be very brief, but I think that we can discuss probably later on in more detail each of the countries involved here. First of all, Iran. It's very clear that Russia now depends on Iran more than it did before the special military operation. And we see that the situational partnership between Moscow and Tehran is gradually turning into something bigger than just a tactical alliance. It is yet to be seen whether it might evolve into a really strategic partnership. I think we are not yet there, but definitely this relationship is going up. We can talk about the military technical cooperation between the two states, and there are many allegations that Iran supplies Russia with its drones. I'm sure that there are some other types of the military hardware that the two sides might exchange. But we also see an increased economic activity that used to be pretty negligible between the two states. Right now, Iran appears to become a central link in the north-south transportation corridor. It has joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which might open additional opportunities for economic cooperation between Russia and the Islamic Republic. Of course, we should also keep in mind what I would call a geopolitical partnership between Moscow and Tehran, and that includes similar rhetoric against the West, against the alleged Western interference into affairs of sovereign countries. It also includes, in some cases, solidarity voting in international organizations, though, of course, Iran does not agree with Russia on all the issues, including the recent territorial acquisitions made by Moscow in Ukraine. And finally, I think, which is probably the most important, and I yield to Anna to talk about that in more detail, the impact that the military operation might have on the Russian approach to JCPOA and to the nuclear programs of Iran in general. Let me limit myself to saying that, of course, that might be another lucrative opportunities for the two states to work with each other and to advance the Iranian nuclear ambitions in this way or another. My second point is on Israel, and of course we see a kind of reverse relationship. The more Russia tilts towards Iran, the more controversial its relations with Israel become. On the other hand, you can also argue that the Israeli leadership is exposed to very strong pressure from both inside and from the outside to support Ukraine and to abandon its neutrality in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. We see that there are certain shifts in the Israeli policies towards the conflict. But at the same time, I think that it would be wrong to say that the Russian-Israeli relationship is moving to a crisis. I think the two states are too important for each other to put this relationship into jeopardy. A lot, of course, will depend on the future political developments in Israel, and the country is in the midst of a very serious crisis, and the outcome of this crisis will be no less important for the relationship between Russia and Israel than the outcome of the special military operation in Ukraine. Third, in terms of GCC, the intention of Moscow is very clear. It needs to expand its contacts to GCC, especially in view of the strong sanction policies exercised by Western countries. As we know, most of GCC countries are not ready to subscribe by the decisions made in Washington and in Brussels. And definitely Russia is looking at GCC as a potential trading partner, as a source of investment. Look at the recent, last year, St. Petersburg Investment Forum, where Qatar was, of course, very explicitly represented. But also, the last but not the least, coordination between Russia and major GCC players, especially Saudi Arabia, of the energy price policy. I think this is really an important development. We saw it before the crisis, but right now with the price cap imposed on Russian oil by the West, that becomes more important for Moscow than ever before. And finally, my time is run out. Just a couple of words on Syria. I think that in Syria, after the beginning of the special military operation, Russia pursues primarily a status quo policy, which implies that there is no real pressure on Assad in terms of political reforms or changes, or even the Geneva process. And at the same time, there is understanding that Russia will not be in a position to take full responsibility for the Syrian economic recovery. Therefore, it becomes so important to break the international isolation of the Bashar Assad government and to make sure that this government is accepted in the Gulf and is able to re-enter the Arab League. We see that Russia is working in this direction quite intensively, and I think not without chances to be successful. And the very last point is that we should also, when thinking about the Russian role in the region, we should keep in mind the recent Chinese initiative, the Saudi-Iranian negotiations. I think that might be a game changer, and that might open new opportunities for Russia to be involved in some multilateral arrangements in the Middle East region. It's not yet clear how that will work, but I think that opportunities are definitely there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrei. Let me actually pose you a follow-up questions, but also if anyone in the audience wants to pose questions, please write it to Q&A box. We already have quite many questions that were submitted to us in a written format. Andrei, one country was particularly missing in your overview of the Middle East. That was Russian-Turkish relationship. So how the war has affected this relationship? And secondly, I will be going to Hamid Reza on this one as well, but I want to hear your perspective from Moscow. You said the situation of partnership with Iran has become something bigger. Can you define this something bigger? So is it right now a strategic alliance between Iran and Russia? Because when you speak to the Ukrainian, they complain that about the Iranian delivery of drones, and they're also worried about a possible delivery of missiles. So that seems to be generate quite tension between Ukraine and Iran, but also probably between the West and Iran.
Well, first of all, sorry for not mentioning Turkey. Definitely, this is an important player, and it has become even more important since the beginning of the crisis. I think that we see what I would call a hyperactive Turkish foreign policy, which involves its attempts to participate in mediation efforts between Russia and Ukraine. The recent extension of the grain deal is partially a product of Turkish efforts. Not only Turkey, but Turkey was very instrumental and very committed to extend the deal. President Erdogan argues that he could arrange a meeting between Putin and Zelensky. I think that Turkey might play a role of a facilitator rather than that of a mediator, because of course Turkey is constrained by its membership to NATO and by its well-known long-term position towards Ukraine and towards its territorial integrity and sovereignty. Now, I think that the relationship between Russia and Turkey remains a mixed bag, as it was before the crisis. But it's clear that the Russian leadership would be willing to support Erdogan, and arguably the Russian leadership would consider any alternatives to Erdogan as being detrimental to Russia's interests. Some here in Moscow argue that the decision to extend the grain deal for 60 days, given all the reservations and all the concerns and all the grievances that Russia has regarding the deal, suggests that Erdogan remains very important for President Putin personally, and the Russian leader is willing to do whatever depends on him in order to support his partner when the situation of this partner might look quite precarious. On the other hand, I don't want to downplay the complications and many wrinkles in this relationship. We can talk about that in more detail, but of course, the relationship remains controversial and will remain controversial in the foreseeable future. Now, as for Iran, I think a lot depends on how we define strategic partnership. And I think that even if we have an extensive military technical cooperation between two nations, it does not necessarily constitute a strategic partnership. There should be something more than that, including common values, common aspirations, multi-dimensional relationship, and most of these elements are still missing in relations between Tehran and Moscow. For instance, the economic relationship is still not well developed. If you compare Iran and Turkey, you'll see a very clear difference that Russia has a lot of economic interaction with Turkey, but not so much with the Islamic Republic. If we are talking about the social interaction, I think that we have even more serious problems there. The social dimension is not really developed. If you take education, research, culture, civil society, it is almost negligible. At least it is very limited. Moreover, there are suspicions on both sides, especially on the Iranian side. The historical track record is complex, not to use a different word. So I don't think that we can argue that there is a strategic partnership. But I think it is also clear that the two countries are moving in this direction, maybe slowly, maybe not always consistently. I think that definitely there is a lot of space to cover, but the relationship is becoming more robust. And I think the West is pushing Tehran and Moscow closer to each other.
The West is pushing Tehran and Moscow closer to each other. I think that's also many is talking about, like Russia and China being closeness as a result of both countries' antagonistic relationship with the West as well. So, but if I understood correctly, the war has not actually, because at the beginning there was expectation as a result of the war, we might see a downsizing of the Russian footprint in the region. But a year on, that doesn't seem to have materialized, right?
You know, I think that the Russian presence in the region is affordable. Even if you take Syria in terms of resources which are spent in Syria, these are very limited resources which Russia can afford, even while conducting its special military operation in Ukraine. Of course, you know, we do not know what will happen, how, you know, sustainable the current Russian resilience is, but it's a relatively minor operation. And of course, what Russia is trying to do is to make sure that it will get investments on its, it will get returns on the investments that it made in the region. So I don't think that the current position is in a direct jeopardy.
Hanna, let's go to the region, to the Middle East. So how this war has affected actually the Middle East. So what are the major implications of the war on the Middle East, but particularly how this has shaped the Middle East relation with the US and Russia at the same time? Because if you read an article in any Western media, one of the first phrases that you will see will tell that the Middle East has engaged in a geopolitical balancing act on the war. So how do you see the future of this geopolitical balancing act at the same time?
Thanks, Galeb, and thanks to the Middle East Council for having me. Galeb, I will make 5 broad points in response to your question and hopefully address the various dimensions of the question that you posed. I'll just list those 5 points up front. The first one is that the war has obviously had an economic impact on the MENA region. Second, the balancing act performed by regional states over this war is likely going to be sustainable, I would argue. Third, Russia is not out of the MENA region, but it will face increasing constraints going forward. Fourth, on balance, the war has turned MENA into an arena for more great power competition, but there are some caveats to this statement. And the fifth point is that the war's broader ripple effects could spur proliferation in the region over the medium to long term. Now, let me go through those 5 points in turn quickly. On the economic repercussions, of course, we all know that the war initially pushed food and energy prices higher, particularly prices for wheat and sunflower oil. And that disruption last spring affected the MENA region disproportionately, given the high dependency of some of those countries on Russian and Ukrainian wheat in particular. And in doing so, those price disruptions amplified pre-existing concerns in the region. I mean, we had high Turkish inflation and economic crisis in Turkey before the war. Many of the grain silos in Lebanon had been destroyed in the Beirut port explosion. We had economic crisis in Syria, of course. We had the effects of COVID, but this shock came in and amplified those concerns. Now, with the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which Andre already mentioned, and the unblocking of Ukrainian ports last summer, that mitigated those effects to some extent. Wheat prices went back to pre-war levels, but I would say that the region does remain vulnerable to trade disruptions emanating from the Ukraine war in the future. Andre noted we have a 60-day extension. Some would argue that's actually not a whole lot, and we never know what might happen in the future. And then there's some countries, I would particularly point out Egypt, that still very much suffer from the economic consequences of this war. That's my first point. The second regards the balancing act by regional states. Yes, despite the economic shocks caused by the war, despite Western unity in condemning Russia, most regional states, as we know, chose to balance between Russia and Ukraine and its Western backers. There was a reluctance to join sanctions against Russia, a reluctance to condemn Russia or break ties with it. And the reasons behind that were, of course, perceptions of the war on the one hand, and then perceptions of one's own interest. And I will just quickly go through this, but I would say, broadly speaking, there was a perception in the region that Ukraine is not the region's war. You know, it's a war in Europe. It's not even necessarily seen as a Russian war of aggression, but perhaps as a war partially fueled by NATO and US actions against Russia. And it's certainly not viewed as a war challenging a rules-based international order, which is the prism that we have in Western capitals. There have also been accusations of Western double standards in responding to the invasion of Ukraine, comparing it to sort of less Western support when it came to the issue of Palestine or the war in Yemen, for instance. There's also, I think, a perception in the region that regardless of this war in Ukraine, we are in an emerging multipolar order. The United States is receding in its presence from the region, and states simply cannot afford to antagonize Russia or China, for that matter. They need these multifaceted relationships. And then, of course, each state in the region has very distinct economic or security interests with Russia. The reason why Egypt needs good relations with Russia differs from Israel, differs from Turkey. But I would say that Western efforts and US efforts over the last year, first of all, to get states like the UAE or Turkey to stop supporting Russian efforts at sanctions evasion, and those efforts at deterring states, for instance, from buying Russian weapons, those efforts have had an impact on the margins. It's not like they've been completely pointless, but I think they will fail to undermine this broader balancing act, pending very extreme circumstances, which we could perhaps debate in the Q&A. What would need to happen for states to drop their ties with Russia? I think that would only happen in very extreme circumstances. Now, my third point, Russia is not out of the MENA region, but it faces constraints. I mean, Andre has already spoken to this. I agree with him. Russia is not going to leave the region. Its presence there is relatively low cost. In fact, the region is becoming more important to a Russia that is sanctioned by the West and where sort of ties with the West, I think, are gone for the foreseeable future. Russia has the means to preserve its presence in Syria. It has the means to preserve a covert presence in Libya, I would argue, and in fact to maintain a presence of Wagner a private military company elsewhere in Africa. I don't think that Wagner losses in Ukraine, in the area of Bakhmut currently, are indicative of a Russian inability to preserve Wagner presence elsewhere in Africa. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if there's interest. But I would say that if we look at Russia's toolkit to exert influence in the MENA region, there will be some constraints. And I want to make 3 points here. Again, Andre has partially spoken to this, but I do think Russia now has a limited military bandwidth to react to broader instability. So if we were to imagine broader issues emerging in Syria, the Russian military would be hard pressed to react to that because its military bandwidth is quite consumed in Ukraine, which is why I also agree with Andre, Russia is largely status quo oriented in Syria. It does not want to rock the boat too much. The second change regarding Russia's toolkit is reduced leverage over both Turkey and Iran. Both of those important countries have gained some leverage over Russia since the invasion for different reasons, and that has consequences in all sorts of arenas, which we can discuss. And the third question regarding Russia's toolkit is, I think there will be a question mark going forward over Russia's attractiveness as an economic partner in some of those specific areas in which the Russians have been competitive. arms sales, and nuclear energy cooperation. What we know so far is that the Rosatom construction of nuclear power plants in Egypt and Turkey is going ahead according to schedule. But I think there are some questions about potential future supply side constraints. And that is a function of the extent to which Western sanctions and export controls will affect certain sectors in the Russian economy, Russia's defense sector, other strategic technologies. And it will also be a question of whether regional countries will look towards other suppliers for some of those strategic technologies, and whether they offered alternatives to Russian supply, which is where China and the United States come in. The fourth point is that I think the MENA region is becoming more of an arena again for great power competition, but there are some caveats. So I think generally speaking, we will see less compartmentalization by Russia and Western countries when it comes to cooperation in the Middle East. And the big example here for me is indeed Russia's attitude on the Iran nuclear dossier and on efforts to restore the JCPOA. I have argued and written that Russia has become less helpful over the last year in restoring the nuclear deal. I'm happy to expand on that in the Q&A if there's interest, but I think this is a real shift from how things were previously. But I don't think that means that Russia will opt for confrontation with Western states on each and every dossier in the Middle East. If we look at the vote on the Security Council to extend cross-border aid into Syria, for instance, in January, that is something that Russia supported. I think, again, Putin-Erdogan ties and Russia wanting to not antagonize Turkey played an important role here. But the Russians are also still frequently saying now that they want to see cooperation in the Middle East Quartet on Israel-Palestine resumed. So I don't think they see confrontation on each and every issue in the Middle East. And quite frankly, there will be dossiers in the Middle East which will remain largely unaffected by what Russia does or what it does or doesn't do. I think the situation in Yemen, Israel-Palestine, the Abraham Accords and further normalization between Israel and Arab states will only be affected by Russian actions on the margins. I think the trajectory of Russia-Iran relations, of course, will have an impact on this, but that's the only sort of effect here. And the last point I wanted to make is perhaps a bit more sort of forward-looking, and that is about proliferation trends. I think, we had initial fears early in the invasion that because Russia, shielded by nuclear weapons, launched a conventional war against non-nuclear weapon states, that other states would rush to develop nuclear weapons as well, including in the Middle East. That was a very pervasive sort of argument at the beginning of the invasion. There's actually no strong evidence that new aspirants to develop nuclear weapons have emerged. In fact, those who have made statements about proliferation intent, and you could include Saudi Arabia in this category, they have an interest in that pre-exists the war in Ukraine. And even recent statements by Saudi that were reported by the Wall Street Journal last week on, seeking US support for their civilian nuclear program and greater security assurances have more to do with their views of Iran than with the war in Ukraine. But that said, I do think that the ripple effects of the Ukraine war could still have negative implications for non-proliferation in the Middle East medium term for two reasons. The first is this declining Russian-Western cooperation on the Iran nuclear file. So if this becomes a sort of a permanent fixture, then we will effectively have an entrenchment of a de facto Iranian nuclear threshold status, an Iranian nuclear hedger. If diplomacy is dead, we're not going back to the JCPOA. What we will then have is a sort of emerging deterrence regime in the Middle East, where other states will seek to take action to prevent Iran from breaking out, from weaponizing. And if this is the reality, countries will make determinations about what they will need in order to feel secure, then it's not inconceivable to my mind that at least a nuclear hedging option could also be on the table. And the second reason is actually broader and more contextual and goes perhaps a bit beyond the scope of a Middle East discussion, but what we're currently witnessing is also the demise of strategic nuclear arms control at the global level. And this may well fuel sort of generally a greater salience of nuclear weapons again over the coming years. And I think if this broad global trend, worrying trend, combines with worrying regional trends, then on balance, this could have negative implications for proliferation in the Middle East. Perhaps I'll end here. Thank you.
Sure. Hannah, just a few follow-up questions. One of them, you rightly said, you said that probably the Middle Eastern Balancing Act will be sustainable, but at the same time, there are more expectation from as regards pressure from the US for on the Middle Eastern countries, so that they don't allow the Russia to use these countries for the sanction evasion. Do you anticipate more compliance by the Middle Eastern states as regards on this point? Will the Middle Eastern countries take a stronger stance vis-a-vis the Russia's possible sanction evasion by using the Middle Eastern countries?
Galip, I mean, generally speaking, yes. I don't think that countries like, I think we're talking in particular about Turkey and the UAE here, which have stood accused of aiding Russian sanctions and evasion. And we know that US officials from the State Department and the Treasury have traveled there in recent months to raise that issue. I don't think these countries are completely immune to Western pressure. And I think it was reported just last week that Turkey has actually stopped the transit of sanctioned goods to Russia after such pressure emerged. So I do think that we will, see some compliance, but I also at the same time think that these states will try to find workarounds to still continue business with Russia in a way that doesn't, produce a risk for them to run afoul of primary or secondary sanctions. How that's exactly going to look like, I think, is something I cannot answer, but I don't think that we will see a situation emerging where they will drop their business ties with the Russians. They will to find workarounds.
You also mentioned that the Middle East will be even more an arena for great power competition, which effectively means we will see more confrontation between the West and Russia, and also by extension China, within the context of the Middle East. We see that Russia is treating the Middle East and to some extent the South and Eastern Front with the West as a single space by its actions. Like today's in the Q&A chat box, we have a question from Jane Kinemont, which she says, this week's reports that Italy believes that the Wagner Group is pushing migrants from Libya towards Europe as part of a deliberate strategy. So we will see probably more of such reports or such actions. But what is missing in this picture, I don't see an increased effort by the West in context in the Middle East to confront Russia or to push back Russia. So, for instance, do you see any increased level of engagement by the Western countries in Syria, in Libya, in countries where Russia is present to contain or curtail Russian influence there? It seems like, this is, we do expect more great power competition in the Middle East, but it hasn't materialized yet, at least not from the Western part.
Yeah, thanks, Galip. Let me make 2 points here. First of all, I do agree there will be more great power competition, but that doesn't necessarily mean that different actors will push for confrontation. So, for instance, to come back to Syria again, I think the Russians will be very careful to push towards something like a military confrontation with Western countries, because they really don't need it right now. That's not in their interest. There have been some reports of sort of harassment of US forces in northeast Syria, but really it's been on a fairly low level overall, because I think it would not be in Russia's interest. I think bringing the competition to the Middle East and the confrontation will manifest in other ways. It's the being less helpful on the restoration of the JCPOA to effectively produce the situation of an Iran that continues to cause friction and tension and problems in the region, and have that be in a sort of calibrated state, because Russia thinks it can thereby produce a situation in which resources and attention from Western states are still consumed by the Middle East, and therefore less bandwidth for NATO's eastern flank and for China. So I think it's going to manifest more in those ways. Is the West not paying attention or not pushing back against this? I think we again have to differentiate. I think there's a real question mark to me whether right now it would be in the interest of US policy or Western policy to try to push the Russians out of Syria. I don't think that's an obvious proposition to make, though I am aware that some individuals have argued for it sort of since last March in order to sort of take advantage of the Russians being bogged down in Syria. But I think a lot of people realize that the status quo and Russia's presence in Syria is preferable to trying to sort of reignite a conflict there. When it comes to Libya, to the Sahel, to Wagner presence in Africa, I mean, Bill Burns was in Libya just a few weeks back. And from what I understand, the American government is quite active in trying to explore opportunities for reducing Wagner presence in Libya and in Africa, because there is a concern that even though Wagner is quite present now in Ukraine, they still have the bandwidth to actually cause a lot of trouble elsewhere. That's also why the Americans designated Wagner a transnational criminal organization just a few weeks ago.
Hamid Reza, Iran-Russia relationship has increasingly come under spotlight since the start of the war. You hear about this from Russia, you hear about this from Ukrainians, you hear about this from the Western countries. How the war has affected, reshaped this relationship, particularly what has been the cost-benefit analysis of the war for Iran? Because what we see in this relationship, some of the things that's happening in this relationship is quite phenomenal. I think Iran just signed last year signed $40 billion worth partnership, right, with Russia.
So thank you very much to the Middle East Council, also my dear friend Galip for inviting me. So the more the two distinguished speakers were talking, the more worried I would become, because, you know, almost everything I wanted to say was already being covered. So I try my best to actually not to repeat, but then forgive me beforehand if that happens.
Your repeating is also sometimes fine to better grasping it.
That's wonderful to hear. So there are four main areas where Iran-Russia relations have been affected to different extents, of course, by the war in Ukraine. First is Iran's nuclear program, of course, and more specifically speaking, the diplomatic track. I'm deliberately not saying negotiations because there's no negotiations going on at the moment, but the diplomatic track to revive the JCPOA. So, as we all know, in the beginning, last March, actually, right after the invasion, Russia started to obstruct the talks and asked for its own guarantees that, the sanctions are not going to harm third parties or third countries. And then, of course, it changed track. But since then, we have seen Moscow basically becoming increasingly supportive of Iran's stance toward the talks, which is something, of course, very unprecedented. Before, Russia used to play the role of more sort of mediator, also in terms of, especially in terms of pushing Iran towards, accepting some of the terms put forward by the other parties. But now it seems that, that approach has changed, basically. So to me, it seems that Russia at the moment is more inclined, or slightly more inclined, at least toward the non-revival of the JCPOA, the status quo with regard to JCPOA, as it could actually again become, the revival of the JCPOA would sort of contribute to at least reducing tensions between Iran and the West, or at least relieve the West from the Iranian threat and give them more freedom of action to deal with Russia. But some also believe that if the JCPOA is restored, Russia can, given its close relations with Iran, can use Iran also as a channel for circumventing sanctions. So I will leave that probably to Hannah, who's the expert on this topic, to expand if there's questions on that. But this is my understanding. The second aspect, which is maybe the most important in terms of international attention, is military cooperation. Here we've seen both quantitative and qualitative changes. And the qualitative, I think, is more important in a way in terms of longer term implications. because for the first time in the history of Iran-Russia relations, Russia is actually on the receiving end of this military cooperation, with Iranian drones being used in Ukraine. Also, there are talks, as was mentioned, about Iran providing missiles to Russia. But of course, on the Russian side, there's also speculations, or more than speculations actually, increasing evidence that Russia may soon deliver Su-35 fighter jets to Iran. So in that sense, as I said, there's a quantitative and qualitative change in the military cooperation between the sides. And this is maybe important to note that apart from the actual military implications and technical implications of this cooperation, Iran uses this opportunity also for two main PR goals. First is to basically boast about its military advances that, as they say, have made great powers interested in having Iran-made military equipment. And second, to send a message or signal to its rivals, regional and trans-regional alike, that Iran now has a partner, at least at the military sphere. Of course, at the technical level, there's also talks about the implications of drones, for example, being used in Ukraine, in terms of Iran getting experience of its drones being used in other fronts than the Middle East, things like that. In terms of economic cooperation, of course, as Andrei mentioned, and you also mentioned that agreement, there have been a lot of talks and also memoranda of understanding have been signed, but the actual progress on that front is marginal. And we should also bear in mind that things like banking cooperation, like North-South transport corridor, these have been on the table for quite some time. Especially speaking of North-South transport corridor, it's more than 20 years that the initial agreement was made between Iran, Russia, and India, and then other countries also expressed desire to join. With regard to banking system, same. It's around a decade that there are talks about that. So the thing is that the economic capacity of both sides has been eroding as a result of the sanctions. And for that reason, I don't see any prospect, at least in the short to medium term, for any substantial economic cooperation between the two sides. And that's, that's where we can speak about the existence or non-existence of strategic partnership, because economic cooperation, to my understanding, is one of the main pillars of any successful strategic partnership, and this is still lacking in the relationship. So what we have been witnessing in terms of Iran-Russia relations has been an ever-expanding sort of military wing of the cooperation, but then economic sphere has remained marginal. As Andrei mentioned, again, the social exchanges have also, and the gap actually at the social level is widening, ever widening, given the protests in Iran and Iranian public seeing Iran as taking side with authoritarian governments like Russia, China. Recently, Belarus has joined the club. So that's how it is seen. And then for the fourth aspect, which is as important as military cooperation, to my understanding, is Iran-Russia cooperation in the Middle East. So there's a broad picture, and then at a kind of more limited level, we have Syria to focus on. So broadly speaking, as Hannah mentioned, this kind of sort of widening gap between Russia and the US and the West in general has happened. So that's where we have seen more synergy at the rhetoric level or narrative level between Iran and Russia. But the thing is that the way that they pursue their kind of anti-Americanism, if you will, differs. Because for Russia, it's all about trying to make even closer relationships with Washington's traditional allies in the region in order to make a distance between them and also to use them for circumventing sanctions, etc., etc. But for Iran, even despite the recent developments for example, with Saudi Arabia, diplomatic initiative, etc., they remain rivals, competitors at the end of the day. And it's all about balancing act. So that's where the strategies differ. And then again, back to economy, Russia sees more opportunities in expanding ties, of course, with wealthy countries of the Persian Gulf than with Iran. And here comes also the Syria issue. Of course, Russia, as Hannah mentioned, is not interested in an escalation with the US in that country. But as far as I can see, the Russians have outsourced that to Iran. And, a flashback to last summer when Putin and Erdogan went to Tehran and there was this Astana summit, there were unprecedented emphasis or unprecedented level of emphasis on the necessity to confront the US in Syria, even by President Erdogan. And that was sort of new. And the Iranians are quite happy with that. Of course, Iran have recruited new militias, have kind of reinforced the militias that it already had in Deir ez-Zor, and they are targeting American interests. So what Russia has done is simply just to back off and not to prevent Iran from that escalation. And the same has happened with regard to Israel. Iran has been installing radar systems, air defense systems, and Russia has just been watching that. So the risk of escalation in Syria is getting higher and higher, not necessarily between Russia and the West, but between Iran, Israel, Iran, and the US. Just a very quick note to answer your second question as well in terms of cost and benefit. So the fact is that Iran's support for Russia in the war in Ukraine has become one of the three major elements which have led to unprecedented tensions with the West as a whole, because with the US, of course, tensions is nothing new. And the other two are, of course, Iran's nuclear escalation and the lack of proper cooperation with the IAEA, at least until recently, before the recent agreement with the IAEA, and it still remains to be seen. The actual impacts. And the second is the brutal crackdown against the protesters at home, of course. But among the three, I think, at least as far as Europe is concerned, the Russia factor plays the most important role in changing European states' threat perception of Iran. Iran being just complicit to the war, just in Europe's neighborhood. And this is further complicating the relationship between Iran and the West, the JCPOA, and all these sorts of things. So there are already talks in Iran, experts warning about that, saying that without Iran revising its policy vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia, there's no progress expected. But of course, the dominant view in the Islamic Republic by its leaders, including the supreme leader, is that this war in Ukraine is a sign that the unipolar US-led international order is in decline, and now is actually the time to take side with the rising powers like Russia and China. So cost and benefit analysis is there, but I don't see any real prospect for a change in Iran calculation as a result of these or not a substantial change, at least, as a result of this calculation.
Just a follow-up question. Will Iran deliver also missile to Russia on top of drones?
That's $1 million question, actually. But then there are reservations on both sides, as far as I can see, because there have been warnings to the Iranian side that if you do that, there's going to be even more pressure in an unprecedented way. So Iran is hesitant. On the other side, we've seen reports that the Russians were also warned that if that happens, then the West will also reconsider this delivery, the quality of the weapons it's delivering to Ukraine. So I think at the moment the prospects are lower than before. But as far as Iran is concerned, I think that might be more probable after October, when the restrictions on Iran's arms export will be removed. That will depend to a great extent on the orientation, the direction that Iran-West relations is going towards. if some sort of agreement is going to happen, then Iran may, to some extent, at least reconsider. But if not, I think that's just a matter of time.
And you simply think that the Iran support for Russia makes a GCPOA very unlikely.
Yes, that's what that's
Yes.
how I can see in terms of the impacts, actually.
Yes, Hannah, I think you want to add.
If I may come in here.
Please.
So Hamid very rightly said that there's three separate issues currently between Iran and the West. One is Iran's nuclear escalations, its reduced compliance with the JCPOA, its recent enrichment of particles to 84%, its reduction of inspection activities, and the fact that it walked away from a final text to restore the JCPOA that was on the table. And then we have the drone supply, which Hamid completely correctly said is the biggest issue for the Europeans. And then we have the protest issue. Something also to note here is that these issues are not completely unrelated. Western countries have argued that Iran's provision of drones to Russia actually violates the terms of Resolution 2231, which underpins the JCPOA, that Iran is effectively violating its terms. And they have argued the Secretary General to investigate the issue, something that Russia, unsurprisingly, has said the Secretary General doesn't have a mandate. This sounds a bit sort of complicated and procedural, but my point here is that the whole drone transfer issue has become inextricably linked to the fate of Resolution 2231 and the future of the JCPOA. So it's not just a sort of political irritant in the background, it actually has become part of the fabric of the negotiations.
That seems to be quite clear. Andre, we have few questions again from the audience for you, actually. One of them is, are there any clear plans on the horizon to confront any international threat that Russian president may resort to? What is the internal position on Iran's support for Russia? I think that has been already answered. But the question is, can Russia afford losing the war in Ukraine? It's not directly related to the Middle East, but there's a question whether Russia can afford losing in the war. And also there is another question which Hannah, you may answer. Can the West afford losing?
Galeb, I think that we should qualify this question. First of all, we are talking about the current Russian leadership, as I assume, not about the country at large, not about the political class, but about the political leadership. And I think the answer is no. The answer is that the leadership cannot afford a failure. It cannot afford a defeat because it perceives the war as existential, as something which will define the future of the country, not just a political regime in the country, but the country at large. And if you follow the statements coming out of the Russian leadership these days, they argue that the goal of the West is not just to weaken Russia, not to defeat Russia in a particular theater, but rather to destroy Russia, to eliminate Russia from the map of the world, to cut Russia into small pieces, and to deal with Russia once and forever so that Russia will never resurrect. Whether it is right or wrong, it's another question, but this is the narrative which is presented in Russia quite often, and I think which is successfully sold to a large part of the Russian population. Another question, however, is how you define a victory. What does it mean to win for Russia? Does it mean to secure the territory of Donbass and Crimea? If so, then the goals of the military operation can be regarded as limited to get hold of the two districts in the east of Ukraine, in their old territorial boundaries, to have land bridge to Crimea, because the Crimean bridge itself turned out to be vulnerable to attacks. So, in the end of the day, that will be about certain territorial gains. And the limits of these territorial gains were defined by President Putin when he made the decision to include the four regions of Ukraine into the Russian Federation in September of last year. However, there is a parallel narrative about what a victory might constitute. And this narrative is based on the assumption that in the end of the day, it's not about territorial gains, it's about the Ukrainian state project at large. And this narrative implies that no matter what specific boundaries a future Ukraine might have, but if this Ukraine remains explicitly anti-Russian, revenge-seeking, deeply integrated into Western security mechanisms, then it will constitute a permanent threat, a challenge to Russia's existence. And therefore, the real victory would mean not just gain certain territories, but rather changing the regime in Kyiv. Whether it is doable, whether it can be accomplished is another question. But we see right now these two narratives that coexist parallel to each other. I think that there is some kind of interconnection between the two. For instance, if Ukraine stays neutral, that might mean that Russia may take a more liberal approach to the territorial settlement. If Ukraine has certain limitations on its future armed forces, that would also mean that probably Russia will not need to push Ukraine that hard. So I think that these minimalist and maximalist agendas still exist parallel to each other, but their future is likely to be defined by how the situation in the battlefield evolves.
There is actually, before I go to Hannah, there is also other question for you that I would like to pose it to you. What possible event in the war over the next years would make China take a much more active role in supporting Russia? That's one. And secondly, another person asked a question about the prospect for cyber security cooperation between Russia and the Middle East after the war.
Well, on the first question, I think that the Chinese position might change in two cases. The first scenario is NATO being involved in this conflict directly. To the extent I can judge about the Chinese position, China is not enthusiastic in supporting Russia against Ukraine, but it would like to render Russia assistance once Russia confronts NATO. So if NATO attacks Russia, if there is an inadvertent escalation, I think China might reconsider the scale and the format of its support to Moscow. And of course, the second scenario is a China-US confrontation, direct military clash around Taiwan. That would also be a game changer, and I think that that would signal that we are getting much closer to a rigid bipolar system, where China and Russia will stand back to back with each other, supporting each other in their respective military conflicts. So these are two options which might change the Chinese approach to the conflict. And the second question was on Galip. The second,
yes.
The second question.
The second question was about the cybersecurity cooperation.
Oh yeah, yeah.
War,
I think that it will partially depend on the outcome of the conflict. It will depend on what kind of capacity Russia will have in cybersecurity. But I think that we will continue to see more and more IT experts from Russia coming to the MENA region, especially to the Gulf, contributing to the development of the indigenous cybersecurity capacity in Gulf states. So at the level of particular individuals, at the level of private companies, this cooperation will expand no matter what. But in terms of state-to-state cooperation, a lot will depend on the outcome of the current conflict.
Hannah, the question of whether the West can afford losing, but also there are other more Middle East specific question. One of them is, aside from Dubai, have any other states in the region received significant inflows of Russian capitals and migrants since the invasion? And there are also quite many comments and questions regarding the Western double standards when it comes to taking a moral stance on invasions. I see people making comparisons or parallels between the invasion of Ukraine and Iraq. So, but these first two questions.
Sure. Look, on the whether the West can afford for Ukraine to lose this war, I think we have to ask what Ukraine losing this war would mean. If it means that Ukraine de facto has to accept that territories of its own country annexed by Russia illegally after a war of aggression just have to be ceded and they're lost for Ukraine, what would that mean from a Western viewpoint? First of all, if we even just arrive at a ceasefire right now and sort of freeze the conflict, that there's a Western concern that Russia would only use such a pause to reconstitute its armed forces, to replenish its ammunition in order to then go further and take more of Ukrainian territory. And that comes from a place of understanding Russian war aims to include that they don't see Ukraine as a sovereign, independent country that has the right to exist as a sovereign state. And the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, has said as much in his own writings. But the problem goes beyond Ukraine. From a Western viewpoint, if this land grab through war of aggression stands and is not pushed back, there's a concern, and it's quite palatable if you go to the Baltic states or Eastern Europe, that Russian aggression might not stop there, that Russia could conclude that a war of aggression is actually a successful endeavor, and that Russia could seek to expand a sphere of influence in the former Soviet space. Now, we could have a debate as to whether that is actually viable, because some analysts rightly point out, well, with what Russian forces would Russia want to wage further aggression against Georgia or Moldova or the Baltic states? Its military is completely consumed and in fact quite decimated in the Ukraine campaign. But there are people who worry that over the medium term, the Russian military will still be able to pose a formidable challenge to European security and could go further. And then there's a third layer from a Western perspective, which is, well, what are the global implications? What are the implications for global order if a Russian war of aggression ends up being successful? What will China conclude from that for how it views the situation in Taiwan? So these are sort of the different levels of Western perspective. So from a Western viewpoint, therefore, there's the perception that at a minimum, Ukraine needs to be supported such that it can create battlefield conditions that will cause Russia to revise its maximalist aims, come to the negotiation table to really faithfully discuss real concessions, and that it has to be forced to revise its maximalist war aims. You know, there's then a debate, of course, in the West as to how far you should go. Some argue the Ukrainians should be enabled to retake everything, including Crimea. That debate largely hinges on perceptions of whether there are, in fact, Russian red lines, where they are, what could possibly trigger a nuclear escalation. There are lots of different viewpoints in that debate. And I don't think that, you know, there is not sort of consensus in the West that things need to go so far. But the overwhelming view is that, you know, seeing Russia successfully annex territory of another sovereign country in Europe is not a situation that can go unanswered. In terms of the second question, I mean, capital and people sort of outflows from Russia into the region, really, I think it's mostly the Emirates and Turkey, of course, both for capital as well as for Russians, for Russian businesses, for individuals. I think otherwise in the region, not so much. It's otherwise more to countries in the South Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia, that a lot of Russians have gone to, but not so much into other Middle Eastern countries, to my understanding.
Anna, let me ask you a question, because the Russia previously has been very pivotal when it comes to nuclear cooperation with many Middle Eastern states. What do you see the future of Russia's engagement in strategic, in areas of strategic significance in the Middle East? Nuclear cooperation deals. Nuclear cooperation deals are one of them. The future of Russia's arms market, or the presence of Russia in the Middle Eastern arms market. How do you envision those things will be affected by the war?
It's a difficult question, Galip, because it depends on a variety of factors. So on the nuclear, first of all, from what we understand to date, Rosatom's ability to continue with its project with El Dabaa in Egypt and the Akuyu nuclear power plant in Turkey has not been affected. Those projects are moving ahead. Rosatom has also signed memorandums of understanding for cooperation with a whole variety of countries. Rosatom has not been sanctioned yet by main Western countries, because Rosatom is so implicated in the global sort of nuclear fuel industry that it's very hard for countries to stop relying on Rosatom. Now, if sanctions against Rosatom were to come in the future, hypothetically, I think that could affect the company's ability for new reactor builds, for example. So, that could affect whether Saudi Arabia, which is still currently running its bidding for its first nuclear power plant, would go with Rosatom as opposed to another competitor. So I think there the jury is still out. But by the way, I think Rosatom's ability to provide nuclear fuel to countries, for instance, to the Bushehr reactor in Iran, will unlikely be affected even by possible sanctions on Rosatom. Regarding the arms sales, I think there's two different dimensions here. There's the supply side and there's the demand. On the supply side, it'll all depend on how Russia's military industrial complex is able to adapt to export controls and sanctions. It will have to produce for its own war efforts massively over the upcoming period. And it has to find workarounds on the sanctions, on the export controls. Will it be able to still produce Su-35s with the highest standards for export? I think that will be the question. So far, there's a mixed picture emerging as to what might be the case there. But it's not just the supply side, it's also the demand side, and whether countries, for instance, will be deterred by the threat of CAATSA sanctions, countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act, whether they will then choose to go to other customers. But this is also where other providers will have to step up to offer alternatives, including the United States, if they want to deter regional countries like Egypt, like Iraq, to stop buying weapons from Russia. But the latest numbers suggest, I think, that Russia's arms exports will not be the same as they were the decade before the war in Ukraine.
Hamid Reza, we have spoken significantly about the Russia-Iran cooperation within the context of Ukrainian war. But I think we also can ask question about how the war has affected Russian-Iranian cooperation in the Middle Eastern conflict zones, for instance, in Syria. What do you foresee there? Because now there is a meeting that is going to take place in Moscow soon between Russia, Iran, Turkey, and the Assad regime. And obviously, the major things on the table is the normalization of the Assad. So how do you see the division of labor between Russia and Iran to play out in Syria? Secondly, I have a question from the audience, which basically is more or less asking about the polls. Are there any independent polls that assess how much Iranian and, for that matter, Russian populations support democracy and human rights? There has been such studies for the Arab countries done by the Arab Center in Doha. So if you can combine both questions, that would be fantastic.
Sure. I mean, I think I briefly mentioned Syria, Iran-Russia cooperation in Syria and how it's been impacted. So generally speaking, since the early weeks after the Russian invasion, actually, we started to see signs of growing coordination, at least if not cooperation, between Iran and Russia, as the Russian forces were getting concentrated in the main bases, Tartus, for example, around the Mediterranean. Some of their bases were handed over to Iranian and Iran-backed forces. And so it was a matter of, there were some sort of similar sort of cooperation between Russian and Iranian forces on the ground before, but the extent has grown. But recently, as I mentioned, there have been a very important development, and that seems to be Russia being comfortable to some extent, at least, with Iran establishing its own air defense systems in Syria. And there are even reports by Israeli media, actually, that there's cooperation also going on in the field of radars, for example, other things. So in that sense, the main implication is that Russia has lost its ability to be a de-escalator between Iran and Israel in Syria, and I wrote about it recently. So it means that, Israel has been already trying to take the matter in its own hands in intensifying attacks, also qualitatively by targeting main airports, for example, Aleppo Airport, Damascus Airport, etc. And also Iran, doing the same thing in terms of strengthening its positions against Israel. So that's what's going on in Syria. With regard to the polls, and there's also some question from the same person I can see about, Iranian support for human rights. No, of course, there's no reliable poll, and that's the kind of one of the features of authoritarian regimes, I think, which don't allow for independent polls to happen. But I think in the case of Iran, at least, the months of protests, which started from last September, people coming to streets as demanding the collapse of the regime, not policy changes, but regime change, that was maybe the most obvious poll that everybody could see all over. And that doesn't mean that it's all about domestic politics. There's always been some foreign policy aspect, as you mentioned, Syria. In 2018, 2018 protests, there started to be protests, chants of leave or abandon Syria, think about us, for example. So people, I would say ordinary people, are generally opposing Iran taking side with authoritarian regimes and oppression inside and outside. So that's how I see the picture, basically.
Well, thank you very, very much, Hamid Reza. It has been an extremely informative discussion. I myself learned a lot from our conversation. So thank you, Andre. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Hamid Reza. And also thank you, my colleagues, Suzan and Qais, for helping to set up this conversation. And also thank you, the Middle East Council on Global Affairs and the participants for the questions, for your interest. It has been an extremely informative and interactive conversation. And as I mentioned in the beginning, this is not a one-time off session. This is part of and continuous effort by us to better understand the evolving nature of this war and its impact in the Middle East. As I mentioned again, last week we hosted Ukraine's special envoy for Middle East and Africa. So we had a great conversation internally. And after this, there will be a new webinar that will be moderated by my colleague, Yahya Zubir. It will particularly be looking at the impact of the war in the Middle East conflict zones, the impact on this Middle East conflict zone. So please remain engaged and have a great day. And thank you very much again for joining us.